Raging wildfires are now a regular feature of southern Europe's summer season. But blazes in Portugal 6 years ago that killed 66 people could now bolster a legal case aimed at forcing nations to speed up action to reduce emissions. 6 young people aged 11 to 24 are suing 32 European governments in Strasbourg, France, at the European Court of Human Rights. Among them, Sofia Oliveira.
If you want to take action and show you that you are capable to change the planet and for the generation that is good, you have to act and respect and listen to our voices.
Their legal teams say the current climate policies of those nations will not reduce emissions as much as required to retain their clients' quality of life.
We're talking about heat extremes which will impact their ability to exercise, live outdoors. They'll be confined indoors for significant periods of time within their lifetime. So we're talking about concrete harm, and we're talking about emissions from across Europe impacting them.
If the 6 can prove those impacts violate their human rights, the implications could be very costly for the governments involved.
The hearing today could be an opportunity to deliver a legally binding decision that would require governments to act, because they have failed to act despite having the resources to adopt more ambitious climate policies.
The court's Grand Chamber is hearing several similar cases this year. In March, a group of women from Switzerland had their own day in court.
Few people have it in their power to change the course of history.
They argued the Swiss governments failed to act on climate change and so infringe their right to life that Europe's Human Rights Convention guarantees. The court will likely rule on both cases and a third from France at some point next year. But as climate change and its consequences continue to expand, similar cases in Europe and beyond could soon do the same. Willem, Marx, Al Jazeera.
Well, joining me now from Strasbourg is Jerry Liston from a Global Legal Action Network. He is the lead lawyer bringing this case. It is an extraordinary case, Jerry Liston, the largest ever climate change case ever filed with the European Court of Human Rights. Can you give us the background, a little bit of background to the case first? Why did these young Portuguese people, one as young as 11, decide to file this case?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Nick. Well, quite simply because they're facing a future of unlivable heat extremes. That's what the science backed by the governments themselves, the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, says about the future that they face. So they're taking what is an unprecedented case in its scale against all these countries, actually the most ever countries to appear before a court in any context ever before, because they're trying to compel them to do much more to reduce their emissions, which is what is necessary to safeguard their futures.
So why to this court in particular? Why not just bring the case to the national courts in Portugal, where they live?
Because Portugal, while it is failing itself in reducing its emissions, it's responsible for only a small percentage of the overall emissions of European states. We took the case against the major emitters within Europe. So we took the EU member states as a whole, and then Russia, Turkey, Ukraine. We subsequently withdrew the case against Ukraine in light of the invasion, and then Switzerland, Norway, and the UK. They make up the major emitters within Europe, and that's why we focused the case on them.
It is an extraordinary challenge, isn't it, taking on the legal teams of over, 30 very, very well-resourced countries. What will you be arguing? How are the plaintiffs impacted?
Yeah, so we presented our arguments today. There were 86 lawyers, we understand, in total there for the governments. We had our much more modest team, but we presented, I think, a powerful and compelling case as to the impacts that the applicants face. This ranges from their current experience of being confined to their homes at times during recent periods of extreme heat. People will be familiar with the devastating heat waves that broke out across Europe this summer, and Portugal didn't escape those heat extremes. But it's the future really where the really extreme impacts are predicted to occur. So we're talking about heat waves bringing temperatures in excess of 40 degrees that last for over a month or more in Portugal. So they're, even by today's deteriorating standards, they're unimaginable in today's terms.
Yes, it's very extreme, isn't it? ruling is expected, I understand, in the first half of 2024. So what happens if the case is successful? What are you hoping that this will achieve?
So the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights are themselves legally binding. So the judgment that we're seeking would effectively be like a treaty that's imposed on the 32 respondent states, compelling them to do much more to reduce their emissions, not just at home, not just within their borders, but we're also saying that states have an obligation to reduce their contributions to emissions beyond their borders. And that includes, for example, by forcing companies, big companies headquartered within their jurisdictions, to reduce their emissions throughout their entire global supply chains in line with 1.5 degrees.
But would it compel them? Wouldn't it just end up being up to the national courts to enforce rulings?
Yes. Well, we've seen in the national court cases taken in Europe about climate change so far, with a striking consistency, the European Convention on Human Rights being discussed by the judges in those cases. The difficulty is they've come to very different conclusions as to how the convention applies. And even in the most successful cases, for example, there was a case by the Dutch Supreme Court in the well-known Urgenda case, which led to the court ordering the Dutch government to do more to reduce its emissions by 2020. But even that decision, if it were replicated throughout Europe and beyond, would be inconsistent with holding warming to even 2 degrees, which is already catastrophic. So what we're looking for is a judgment that would essentially act as a roadmap for national courts that could then compel their governments in future climate cases taken there to reduce their emissions in line with the amounts that we say they must.
All right. Great to talk to you, Jerry. Appreciate that. Jerry Liston, Senior Lawyer at the Global Legal Action Network, Case Lead. Thanks very much indeed, Jerry.
Thanks for having me, Nick.